Michael Gregsten and Valerie Storie set off from Slough last night to organise the Bedfordshire checkpoints in a motor rally for the staff of the Road Research Laboratory where they work. They picked up a hitchhiker. In the small hours of this morning, they were pushed out onto the patch of grass behind me, now screened, between this lay-by and the A6 road 8 miles south of Bedford. At 6:45, they were found by a workman. Mr. Gregsten shot in the head and Miss Storie in the chest.
There's a stretch of road in Bedfordshire known as Deadman's Hill, an old coaching incline on the A6, a lonely lay-by where headlights skim the hedgerows and the countryside seems at peace. On Tuesday the 22nd of August 1961, slipping into the early hours of the 23rd, two young lovers were forced into that lay-by after a long, terrifying journey, driven through quiet villages, through service stations and along London's darkened back streets. All of it from inside a small grey Morris Minor. A stranger with a gun had taken control of their fate. By morning, one of them was dead, the other was left for dead. It left a survivor whose testimony never wavered, and the gunman's voice burned into their memory. What happened on that lonely stretch of the A6 turned into one of Britain's most infamous criminal cases. It captured the nation's attention through the courtroom battles and involved a suspect who was executed while still claiming innocence. The case sparked years of intense public campaigns and decades later was revisited with the clear evidence of DNA testing. This is the story of the A6 murder. Michael, a research scientist, and Janet Gregsten had been having marriage problems since the birth of their second son in 1959. Michael had moved into lodgings in the spring of 1960, and in 1961 he found an apartment in Windsor. The couple had tried to work on their marriage, but without success. Leading up to the 22nd, he had taken some time off work at the research laboratory at Langley to go on holiday with his wife and the children, while they once again tried to repair their marriage, and Michael temporarily moved back home. Valerie Storie had also taken some time off work and went on holiday with a friend. It had become known that Gregsten and Storie had begun an affair a few months back, and Storie's parents became aware that Michael was a married man. Janet Gregsten had also found out. The affair was discouraged, but would continue. In the early evening of the 22nd of August, he left the flat at around 4:30 p.m. and told Janet he would be back late. Before seeing Valerie, he picked up some laundry from the laundrette and then went back to pick Valerie up from work at Langley. They hung around together before going to the Old Station Inn at Taplow around 7:45 p.m. And here the terrifying story begins in Buckinghamshire. The two colleagues from the Road Research Laboratory in Slough had borrowed a car for a few private hours away from prying eyes. Michael Gregsten, 36, was a scientist and a family man. Valerie Storie was 22 and a young researcher at the start of her career. Their friendship had deepened beyond the workplace. They were in a grey four-door 1956 Morris Minor, registration 847BHN. After a quiet drink at a pub in Taplow, they left around 9 p.m, although the landlady of the pub thought it was a little later. They turned right into Huntercombe Lane and through the village of Dorney. They came to a cornfield off Marsh Lane and pulled into the secluded, narrow lane beside the cornfield, a spot they had been to before. Inside the car, the windows slowly misted with breath as they talked. Then there was a sharp rap on the glass against the driver's window. A startled Michael turned and slowly wound the window down, and as he did, a large black revolver was pushed inches from his face. "This is a hold-up. I'm a desperate man." The man demanded the ignition key. The back door was opened and the stranger climbed into the back seat. Storie recalled that the man was talkative, almost conversational, and he spoke with a Cockney accent. He had an outlaw-style mask covering the lower part of his face. It was a handkerchief covering his face over his nose down to his chin. The man then told them to lock all the doors and not turn around. "I've been on the run for 4 months," he said. "If you do as I tell you, you'll be all right," he continued. The gun never wavered from Gregsten's back, and according to Valerie, some conversation was held. The gunman mentioned he was hungry and went on to say, "This is a real gun." She said he mentioned it was a 38, but she didn't know what that meant. Also, according to Valerie, both she and Gregsten asked the gunman where he had come from. He said he had come from the Oxford area and had been living rough for 2 days. She thought it odd because he looked immaculate. As she recalled, the suit he was wearing was an ordinary dark respectable suit. He asked if the couple was married and they replied they were not. He told Gregsten to ease the Morris Minor further off the lane and into the edge of the field and then stop. They were parked in a cornfield next to a harvester. They were parked there for some time, somewhere in the cornfield. The couple sat in silence, unable to move. The gunman demanded they hand over their money. Gregsten handed his wallet with £3 in it, and Valerie handed over her purse, but she apparently managed to take some money out and push it down her bra. Valerie would later remember the details. The suit he was wearing was dark and ordinary, almost respectable, and he kept talking. Storie claimed he had spoken about being in an institution when he was younger and Borstal and remand homes, and just filling the silence. Then suddenly and abruptly he noticed a man in his back garden and the light caught his eye. He became restless and ordered Gregsten out of the car. According to Valerie, he laid a rug on the floor of the boot. He was going to put Michael in there, but she managed to talk the gunman out of it. He then ordered Michael, "Drive." Directing them, he led them back to the A4. At the junction, he told Gregsten to turn right to Slough. The talkative gunman went into some detail during the travelling, stating that he had just done a 5-year stretch in prison and hadn't eaten in 2 days. The gunman was hungry, and when they came across a dairy, they stopped at the milk machine. It was about 11:45 p.m. as they drove through Slough. The man then asked about petrol. Valerie said they hadn't much left in the tank, which wasn't exactly true. They pulled into a garage and the gunman gave Gregsten orders that he was to wind the window down and ask for 2 gallons of petrol with a warning not to say anything or he will be shot. They left and continued onwards to London. The couple, now realising they were not returning to the cornfield while driving through the streets towards the outer suburbs of London, they travelled through Watford and towards St Albans, and at one point Gregsten tried to attract the attention of another driver by flashing his rear light. After some time, the gunman said he needed a kip. He was tired. About a mile north of Clophill on the A6, they came to a relatively isolated stretch of road where there was a picnic lay-by bordered by grass verges and hedging, which the gunman directed Gregsten to stop at. This area was known as Deadman's Hill in Malden, Bedfordshire. Both Valerie and Michael had begged the gunman to just take whatever they had and leave, but he didn't seem interested. He was tired. Storie said he wanted to sleep. The gunman looked for something to tie Gregsten and Storie up while he grabbed some sleep. Taking Gregsten with him, he looked around and found some rope in the boot of the car. Back in the car, he tied Storie's wrists with Michael's tie. There was a duffel bag with laundry in the footwell of the driver's side. The gunman told Gregsten to pass the bag to him. Storie goes on to explain what happened. As Gregsten went to pass the bag over, the gunman suddenly shot twice. She recalled the noise and the smell of the gunpowder. Then she saw Mike slumped over the steering wheel, covered in blood. She screamed, "You shot him! Why did you do that?" His response was that Gregsten had frightened him, that he had moved too quickly. What followed was confusion. Valerie screamed they should get a doctor. The man didn't know what to do. He yelled at her to be quiet. He was thinking. He rummaged in the bag of clothes, pulling out some pyjama trousers that he placed over Michael's face. Valerie states she tried to calm the gunman down by talking to him. She told the man she would take him somewhere to get a lift while she went to get help for Mike. But this wasn't going to happen. Valerie continued that the man told her that his name was Jim, but she didn't believe that was his real name. He then asked for her name and asked her to kiss him. She refused. He asked once more, and this time added if she didn't, he would shoot her. This time she knew he meant it. She had to give in, and the man went on to violate her. At this moment, a car drove past with its headlights on, and she caught a quick glimpse of the gunman's face. It was almost daybreak. Hours and hours had passed since the ordeal began, and Valerie was eager for the man to leave. She snapped at him, telling him to just take the car and go. But he pointed out that Gregsten's body was still inside and it needed to be removed. He ordered Valerie to drag Michael's body out because he couldn't get blood on him. Valerie struggled to drag the body out of the driver's seat, but she couldn't do it on her own, so the gunman had to help. Once the body was out, Valerie pulled him to the edge of the road. The gunman put the rug from the trunk on the driver's seat, and then he asked Storie to show him how to start the car. It was clear to her that he wasn't familiar with this kind of car. He asked her to explain how the pedals and the gears worked. Later, this was considered strange. While the engine ticked over, the gunman went up to Valerie as she sat next to Michael's body and said he thought he ought to hit her over the head or something so she couldn't run for help. She promised him she wouldn't if he would just go quickly. He began to walk away. He turned and began firing bullets at her. When the first two hit, she slumped over onto the ground. He then shot at her 3 more times. She lay on the ground, not daring to make a sound. She was in pain, but terrified. Did he think she was dead? Could she convince him? The man stood for a second, then walked to the car and drove off in the direction of Luton. The time was about 3:30 a.m. She lay there before trying to find something, anything to attract the attention of someone who might pass by. She threw some rocks that were close by and screamed out for help, but the isolated stretch of road was too quiet. Valerie eventually slipped into unconsciousness. She lay there for 3 hours. At around 6:30 a.m., an elderly farm worker, Sidney Burton, spotted her laying on the concrete. He didn't know what to do, so ran for help, and he came across student John Kerr, who was collecting information for census purposes close to an RAC box. Kerr ran to the spot and discovered the 2 bodies on the ground. He noticed Storie was still alive, but Gregsten was no longer. Kerr stated that Storie was conscious enough to tell him she'd been shot. Meanwhile, a car was coming down the road when the driver noticed a young man ran out in front of him. Kerr told him to go get the police as someone had been shot. The driver, Thomas Ray, went to the RAC telephone box and dialed 999. While Kerr waited with Storie, he said she gave him some details of the man who had done this to them, and he wrote them on his clipboard. She said they'd picked up a man near Slough. She told him what had happened. He took the number plate of the car, her name, and a brief description of the man. She said he had big staring eyes, fair to brown hair, slightly taller than her. She was 5'3½".
She was able to say that a gunman had held them up at Slough, rather, she'd picked him up at Slough, and that he'd held them up and shot her.
Thomas Ray returned after calling the emergency services, and eventually an ambulance and the police arrived at the scene. Early that morning, Wednesday the 23rd of August, Janet Gregsten was wondering where her husband was. Detective Chief Inspector Harold Whiffen of Bedfordshire Police and a policewoman followed the ambulance carrying Valerie Storie to the Bedfordshire General Hospital, hoping to get information as soon as possible. Consultant orthopaedic surgeon Andrew Pullen ordered a blood transfusion and looked at the bullet wounds. He saw 4 hits to the left shoulder and 1 further over to the left, and there was a further wound to the neck. It became clear early on that she was now paralyzed in the lower part of her body. Despite everything she'd been through, Detective Chief Inspector Whiffen and the doctors agreed that she was fully aware of what was happening. Mr. Pullen asked Miss Storie about the attack on her, and she had replied it was under threat of the gun. Both he and the police agreed she was compos mentis. Valerie Storie, angry and determined, gave as much information as she could.
The police officer in whose division this happened is Superintendent Morgan of Biggleswade. Superintendent, what help do the police want from the public?
Well, we're anxious to trace a man of the following description. Aged about 30 years, 5 feet 6, proportionate build, dark brown hair, palish face, brown eyes, very deep set, not very deep set, straight nose, wearing a dark lounge suit, and believed to have an East End London accent.
A description was taken and circulated to the evening newspapers and to other police stations, along with instructions that all inquiries should be made at garages and filling stations. If the car is found, please preserve for fingerprints and detain suspect if with the vehicle. He should not be questioned regarding the murder. It is believed the suspect forced the deceased and the woman to give him a lift in the car at about 9:30 p.m. at Dorney. The early newspapers gave the description as a man being aged about 30, 5 foot 6 inches tall, of medium build, wearing a dark brown suit. He has dark hair, a pale face, and deep set brown eyes, and he talks with an East End accent. The police warned that they believed he was still in possession of the weapon. On the 24th, the morning papers gave varied accounts of the description, but most kept to the original. But some ran with the news that they had picked up a hitchhiker who had attacked both of them and had a lot of the details wrong. Not that they knew that at the time. The newspapers wrongly believed there was a violent, crazed hitchhiker on the loose, warning drivers not to stop and give strangers lifts, which is very good advice anyway. As the day began on the 23rd, investigative reporters had already uncovered the story. At Deadman's Hill, onlookers, journalists, and media crews began to assemble, held back by police. Among them was student John Kerr, who spoke with a police officer and explained that he had written down on a blank sheet attached to his census clipboard what Valerie Storie had told him when he found her. The officer advised him to hand it over and took possession of the note. That crucial piece of early evidence subsequently disappeared and was never seen again. How it was lost remains unknown. Unfortunately, it was first thought that the attack was committed by a hitchhiker, which wasn't the case. According to Storie, it must have been some miscommunication between herself and the student John Kerr. He had based this directly on Storie's immediate description of events and taken this as if they'd stopped to offer the man a lift. At Deadman's Hill, Michael Gregsten's wife, Janet, had been taken to the spot where he lay so she could identify his body that afternoon. He hadn't been moved. It was a crime scene, and Scotland Yard had been called in to give the local police assistance. Detective Superintendent Robert Acott, a much respected and seasoned detective, and his assistant, Detective Sergeant Kenneth Oxford, were put on the case and arrived at the scene, joining Detective Inspector John McCafferty, Detective Sergeant Harry Evans, and of course, Detective Superintendent Barron of Bedfordshire Police. They were joined by Home Office pathologist Professor Keith Simpson. Michael Gregsten's body was moved to Bedfordshire mortuary, where Professor Simpson carried out the post-mortem at around 5:30 p.m. He concluded that Mr. Gregsten had been shot 2 times. He was shot once in the head and once in the upper body region between the hours of 3 and 4 a.m. Around late evening, the detectives arrived at Bedfordshire General Hospital to talk with Valerie Storie. The detectives stated they needed to get a complete statement of Valerie themselves and began taking a 9-page statement that took about 2 hours. The Morris Minor was found on the evening of the 23rd in Ilford, London, with some damage to the front. And when looking inside, they saw the amount of blood covering the seats and the floor, confirming that it was most definitely the car they were looking for. On the 24th of August, the newspapers reported the finding of the Morris Minor. Edward Blackall, a workman who had witnessed what he believed to be this car, got in touch with the police. At 7 a.m. on the 22nd of August, 2 men, Edward Blackall and co-worker John Skillett, were travelling together to work in Skillett's car from the outer London suburb. When they slowed down behind an Austin A40 at traffic lights on Leigh Street, suddenly a Morris Minor sped past them down the side of them and swerved in front of their car, just missing them. The driver hit his brakes and reversed back, pulling up in the lane next to them. It then took off at speed. The workers watched the Morris Minor swerving and going into other lanes. They eventually managed to pull up beside the car, wound their windows down and gave the driver an earful. The man just smirked at them and took off. They watched him continue to drive erratically before the Morris Minor vanished from their sight. After reporting, Mr. Blackall was taken to see the car and he identified it as being the one he had encountered. James Trower had also seen the small grey car and noticed the bad grinding noise when the gears were being changed, and he believed he had had a good look at the driver. He told the police when they were out doing door-to-door inquiries.
Well, on that morning, like, I've come down here to pick up Paddy Hogan, used to live here, and of course, while I'm waiting for Paddy to come down, I walked back towards the car. At that moment, 1956 Morris come thundering up the street here and shot round the corner into Avondale Crescent. You see, well, I didn't think much of it, really, and well, as I was going to work, I mentioned it to Paddy, and he said something about it. Bit of a dodgy road round here. I said, look, they all drive like that, it must be. You see, so never thought no more of it. Well, I went. Then when we get to the top there, he turned me round, we come back, and of course all the coppers were round there then, and he said about I'd seen a bloke come up the road here and turn round the corner, and they asked me all about it. Well, he said, how long did you see the bloke? What's it all about? 3 seconds roughly, you know, and then little time passed and I had to go down and identify a person who I picked out as James Hanratty.
Well, on the morning of the 23rd, I was standing at the street door waiting for my friend to go to work around about 6:45, and I was reading the morning paper, and there was a car past me. I glanced up at a car. It was a Morris Minor, a Morris 1000. Colour was grey. I happened to glance up at it as it went past, and I went into Avondale Crescent. And I didn't take much more notice of it than that. No, it wasn't James Hanratty at all. I noted that I'd seen the bloke distinctively, and he wasn't James Hanratty. That much I can vouch for. And the chap I seen was, as far as I can recollect, was dark-haired, clean-shaven. Wouldn't like to estimate his age, but as far back as I can remember, that was the description of the bloke. I wouldn't like to say whether he had glasses on or not, but it wasn't Hanratty. That much I can definitely vouch for.
Well, now Mr. Hogan has got 2 mornings mixed up, because the morning before he was waiting in the street. That particular morning I had to knock for him. You see? That's where I think he got, I mean, Everybody gets mixed up, we know that. Well, he's got more or less, you might as well say the excitement, he's got two mornings rolled into one. I picked out the person who I see.
The car had been abandoned close to the Red Bridge Underground, so it was presumed the gunman may have gone to catch a train into London. On the 24th of August 1961, a bus cleaner, Edwin Cook, discovered a revolver under the back seat on the top deck of a 36A London bus at the Rye Lane garage in Peckham, South London. It was wrapped inside a dirty handkerchief and contained live rounds, and additional ammunition was found with it. Later ballistic testing confirmed that the revolver was the weapon used to shoot Michael Gregsten and Valerie Storie. No identifiable fingerprints linking a suspect were recovered from the car or the gun. Also on the 24th of August at 11 a.m, something terrifying happened to a 23-year-old Audrey Willis, who was in her home with her baby son Hugh in Old Nebworth, Hertfordshire, when she answered a knock at the back door. A man stood there and asked for her husband. She replied he wasn't there at the moment. The next thing she knew, he was pointing a short black gun at her and forced his way in the house. He said she should do as he told her so she wouldn't be hurt. The baby began to cry, and the man told her to bring him in and sit him on the floor. Reluctantly, she did as he asked. While baby Hugh sat on the floor, the man demanded money from her, panicking Audrey. She ran upstairs to get a bag and quickly gave him £4. He made her walk to the door and told her not to call the police, as he would be watching her. He left and she locked the door, grabbed her son and telephone, hid behind the sofa and called the police. The police arrived and took her in the car straight away to see if she could spot the man around the area. She couldn't spot the man anywhere. She managed to give a description. He was aged about 30, had a long, thin face and pale complexion. Her description was later relied upon by the prosecution to suggest similarity in appearance and conduct with the alleged A6 gunman. The police asked boarding houses, small hotels and lodging houses to report any male guests who had arrived suddenly or without luggage. Anyone who had checked in during the night of the 22nd, 23rd of August, any man who appeared nervous, agitated or evasive, guests who had left abruptly, particularly on the morning of the 23rd, anyone paying cash or anyone they thought might have given a possible false name and address. Any guests seen behaving suspiciously, men matching the early description circulated by the police. Medium build, fair to light hair, London accent, though early descriptions did vary. The detectives hoped that someone living near the field might have seen something, but no one reported seeing a man near there at night, though there were some reports of strangers throughout the day. When a photo fit was released on the 31st of August, a married couple and their neighbour contacted the police with some information they thought might help. Mrs. Cobb said on Tuesday the 22nd of August at around 2:30 in the afternoon, she went outside because her dog was barking. There was a man walking past who spoke to her regarding the dog. She said he was wearing a dark suit, aged around late 20s and about 5'6". He had dark hair that was brushed back. She said she didn't hear an accent in his voice. Mr. Cobb affirmed his wife's description and added that the man had pale skin and he carried a part rolled up carrier bag. The Cobb's neighbour had also seen this man and gave his description that seemed to match theirs, adding although his hair was brushed back, it wasn't tidy and looked to be receding from his forehead. He also added that he had seen the same man twice, about 2 to 3 weeks before the 22nd of August, but he didn't recognise him as being local. They all agreed he looked like the photo fit. House-to-house investigations were carried out later by local police, but it would seem nobody saw this man. A young man on a motorcycle saw a Morris Minor parked up at the gates, pointing in towards a cornfield at just after 9:45 p.m. He did notice a light on inside the car and the back windows misted up, but he thought nothing of it at the time. By the 26th of August, Valerie Storie began to refine the details. She stated that the gunman was definitely not a hitchhiker, and there was no reason why the gunman had chosen this couple, except that he was a chancer and they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Acott now decided to use the fairly new technique, the identikit. Detective Sergeant Jock Mackle, Scotland Yard's expert on the identikit, was sent to sit with Miss Storie on the 26th, and he began to piece together a picture of this man. Sometime around the 27th of August, hotel manager Peter Sims of the Alexandra Hotel was approached by a guest who was being disturbed by the occupant in the room above hers. She complained that the person had been pacing up and down the room at night, and it had been happening on and off for days. Mr. Sims kept a close eye on the man who had booked into the hotel on the evening of the 23rd of August, under the name of Frederick Durant, and gave a Horsham address. He noticed that the man hadn't left his room and hadn't come down for any meals. Mr. Sims decided to call the police. DS Arthur Kilner arrived with a constable. They questioned Mr. Durant and asked him if he would come to the police station for routine inquiries, and he agreed. At Bedford police station, he revealed that his real name was Peter Louis Alphon. When asked where he was on Tuesday night, he explained he was visiting his mother in Streatham and spent the night at the Vienna Hotel, Sutherland Avenue, Maida Vale. He had signed in as Mr. Durant. The sergeant inquired at the hotel, and it was confirmed that a man of that name had stayed the night of the 22nd. The police discovered that Alphon was nomadic, living from hotel to hotel, making a living selling almanacs as a door-to-door salesman. Interestingly, his dad worked for Scotland Yard in their aliens department. A long statement was taken that took a few hours gathering his day-to-day movements, and it had been noted that at no point did he mention meeting anyone else, only his mother. When asked about his movements on August the 21st, he told them he was a bit of a loner and liked to take walks. He claimed that on Monday the 21st, he'd slept under the pier at Southend, and on Tuesday the 22nd, he booked into the Vienna Hotel. He then travelled to Streatham to see his mother, near to where she lived. He said he hadn't gone to the home because he didn't get on with his father. He returned to the hotel via the underground later. The next day, on the 23rd, he met his mother for lunch and went for a walk, and later the cinema. The rest of the week he just spent time to himself and went walking. The police seemed satisfied with his explanation of his week and released him later that night. The statement was sent to Scotland Yard. Alphon turned up at the police station the next day to see if they needed anything more from him. By the end of August 1961, the investigation was facing a serious problem. Police had gathered multiple witness descriptions, but they did not align. Detective Superintendent Robert Acott had to make a difficult decision. Valerie Storie, the surviving victim, had given a detailed and consistent account of her attacker. However, other witnesses described someone who differed slightly in facial appearance. The identikit officer tasked with constructing the images, Jock Mackle, worked carefully through each account. It soon became clear that trying to combine all the descriptions into a single likeness would produce an unreliable result. So instead, a principal composite was created based on Valerie Storie's description, while a further composite image was prepared, drawing on the amalgamated accounts of the other witnesses. The difference between the two faces was quite noticeable. Some witnesses later indicated that the secondary composite did not precisely resemble the man they believed they'd seen. Each had given an individual description, yet the final image was necessarily a blending of features and was not an exact match to any one account. On the 31st of August 1961, the identikit image was shown on television and released to the press. It appeared in national newspapers shortly afterwards. Shortly after the composites were released, Bedfordshire police issued a revised description stating that the man being sought had icy blue eyes. The adjustment caused some confusion and would later add fuel to debate, a small but significant detail in a case that would become one of Britain's most controversial murder investigations. Peter Louis Alphon, born 1926 and one of two children. He came from a well-educated middle-class background. His father was Felix Alphon. He was described as intelligent and articulate, but also erratic, eccentric, and odd in behaviour. He spent much of his adult life moving around London and living in inexpensive hotels under various names. By the 1950s and early 60s, he was regarded by some as emotionally unstable. He had a record of minor crimes and he struggled to settle in regular employment, holding down casual jobs at times, but was mostly a drifter and a known liar who often exaggerated to appear more important. He regularly used fake names. He had been described by those who knew him as volatile. Later, writers, particularly Paul Foote, saw Alphon as a possible alternative suspect, arguing that he had not been fully investigated. James Francis Hanratty. James Hanratty was born in 1936 and he was the eldest of four sons in a Catholic family that had later moved to Kingsbury in northwest London. From an early age, he had struggled at school. Teachers described him as slow to learn. He remained in mainstream education but left at 15, barely able to read or write. Shortly after leaving school, his father secured him a job with the local council's public cleansing department in 1951. While still living at home in Kingsbury, Hanratty experienced a serious accident. Riding his bike, he fell and was knocked unconscious. Accounts suggest he may have been unconscious for several hours, possibly up to 10. He was taken to hospital and treated before returning home. In July 1952, aged 16, he suddenly left home for Brighton without telling his family. Once there, he collapsed in the street, apparently weakened by exhaustion, lack of food or money, and was admitted to the Royal Sussex County Hospital. This episode marked one of the early indications of the challenges that would shape his young adulthood. Doctors suspected a hospital brain hemorrhage and he was transferred to St Francis Hospital in Haywards Heath, where surgeons performed a craniotomy. Later commentary suggests the diagnosis may have been mistaken. He remained in care for weeks. There is no clear evidence that the operation altered his personality, but in later years, supporters would argue the injury marked a turning point. After his discharge, he was sent to stay with relatives in Bedford. There he found manual work, operating machinery at a breeze block factory. It was steady employment and one of the longest continuous stretches of legitimate employment in his early life. For a time it appeared he might settle into an ordinary settled life. He remained there for a couple of years. But accounts describe Hanratty as easily bored and impulsive, and it would appear he had grown restless and started his petty offending again. In September 1954, aged 17, he was put on probation for a year for taking a car without consent. By 1954-1955, he was increasingly drawn back to London, in particular Soho. It was here that petty offending began to escalate. Car theft, housebreaking, small-scale larceny. He went to prison for housebreaking and stealing property. While inside Wormwood Scrubs and still only 18, he attempted to take his own life. A prison doctor described him as a potential psychopath. There's no notes as to why this was thought. From this point on, his life followed a pattern of short-term jobs, petty crime, prison sentences, and drifting between towns and cheap lodgings. By 1957, he was back in prison after only being out for a few short months. Once again, it was for car theft, and again in 1958 for car theft. But this time, he got 3 years corrective training at Manchester, and served the full sentence. After leaving Strangeways Prison in Manchester in March 1961, Hanratty returned to the Bedfordshire London area. He told his family that he was determined not to return to prison. His father, James Hanratty Sr., took the significant step to give up his own employment to establish a small window cleaning business, hoping steady work and routine would help his son settle. For a short time, Hanratty worked with his father and seemed willing to try a legitimate path. But this did not last. When the family left James alone while they went on holiday, Hanratty had drifted back to London and the company he had known before. He was just 25 years old, and Hanratty already had a growing criminal record and a reputation as a small-time offender. He was not a notorious gangster, not a mastermind, not even particularly successful. Back in London, he managed to acquire a couple of suits cheaply from some old friends. He drifted between cheap boarding houses and lodgings in northwest London and occasionally stayed with acquaintances. At the time the identity kit came out, James Hanratty was staying with Charles Dixie France in Maida Vale and left the address with newly dyed black or darker brown hair shortly after the composite image was circulated. On August the 31st, 1961, Bedfordshire Police issued an updated public description of the suspect. This new notice mentioned that the man had very light or icy blue eyes, which was a notable change from the earlier description of dark, staring eyes. Valerie Storie gave more details during further interviews, and the police thought the eye colour would help identify the suspect. Later, this detail became one of the many disputed parts of the case. The evidence of Mrs. Maida Vale formed an important part of the prosecution case at the 1962 trial of James Hanratty. The police examining the A6 case had been reviewing reports of recent armed SA reports in the wider London area. Investigators noted similarities between Delal's description of her attacker and Storie's account of the A6 gunman. On the evening of the 7th of September, Mrs. Delal was alone in her basement flat in Richmond, Surrey, when a man entered through a window. She later told police and the court that he was carrying a black revolver, which he used to threaten her. According to her account, he described himself as a housebreaker who needed money. He tied her hands behind her back with stockings, gagged her, and violated her at gunpoint. Before leaving, he took a small sum of money and some jewellery. At trial, the prosecution relied on what is known in law as similar fact evidence, arguing that it demonstrated a pattern of behaviour consistent with the A6 attack. Mrs. Delal described her assailant as having a noticeable Cockney accent and said he could appear oddly conversational or polite despite the violence. The prosecution suggested that this behaviour mirrored the manner described by the surviving A6 victim and pointed toward a recognisable pattern in the attacker's conduct. On the 11th of September 1961, a manager at the Vienna Hotel in Sutherland Avenue, Maida Vale, was inspecting room 24, a basement room. He noticed a piece of material hanging from a chair. When he bent down to remove it, two .38 caliber cartridge cases fell down. Remembering police inquiries made weeks earlier in connection with the A6 murder, he contacted the police. Officers attended shortly afterwards and seized the items. At Scotland Yard, forensic examiner Harold Nichols conducted ballistic tests. The cartridge cases were determined to have been fired from the same revolver used to kill Michael Gregsten. Detective Superintendent Robert Acott then focused his attention on the Vienna Hotel and used nearby Broadway Court, managed by the same people, as a base for inquiries. Examination of the hotel register showed that a man signing himself in as J. Ryan had occupied room 24 on the night of the 21st leading into the 22nd of August 1961, the night before the attack on Gregsten and Valerie Storie. Records also showed that Peter Louis Alphon, using the name Durant, had also stayed at the Vienna Hotel on the 22nd to the 23rd of August. Police had previously looked into Alphon's odd behaviour on the 27th of August. Aycott decided these two names needed a closer look. In September, Aycott interviewed Alphon's mother, who told him she had given her son a suitcase around this time. J. Ryan had booked into the Vienna Hotel after being sent over from the Broadway court between 9 and 11 p.m. on Monday the 21st of August 1961. He was shown to his room. The next morning he ate breakfast and left the hotel at around 8:30 a.m. He returned claiming he had forgotten something. It was claimed that when he returned to reception, he inquired how to get to Queensway. He was told to walk and catch a bus, a number 36. This is said to be debatable. It's here we have to remember that the gun was found on a 36A bus. Alphon checked in as Durant on August the 22nd and was shown to room 24. That evening, Durant left his room, saying he would return late. He went out sometime between 9 and 11 p.m., but did not come back by the next morning, August the 23rd, or at least nobody saw him return. The hotel caretakers, the Nuds, went to bed in the early hours of the morning, according to them. The caretakers had left a note informing him that they had moved him to room 6. They also left the keys to the new room. The next morning, all the guests had gone for breakfast, except for the one in room 6. Caretaker manager William Nuds claims he went to check if the occupant of the room was there and if he wanted breakfast. He claimed he opened the door and, according to him, saw Durant standing by his bed pulling up his trousers. He looked messy and didn't want breakfast. He also claimed his suitcase seemed to contain dirty clothes. When asked what time he had got in that night, Mr. Nuds claimed he said 11 p.m. The caretaker manager said he thought that was odd because he would have seen him. He left the hotel just before noon. It has to be said that Mr. Nuds had a criminal record for dishonesty. During the investigation, he changed his story multiple times. In late September 1961, Detective Superintendent Bob Aycott made inquiries with Alphon's family, including his father, Felix Alphon. By late August and early September 1961, Peter Alphon had become a significant suspect in the A6 investigation under Detective Superintendent Aycott. Alphon had stayed at the Vienna Hotel on the 22nd to the 23rd of August and had also behaved erratically at the Alexander Hotel shortly after the crime. The hotel caretakers were unable to confirm when he returned on the night of the 22nd of August, leading police to suspect he may have come back in the early hours following the shooting of Michael Gregsten and the attack on Valerie Storie. Alphon's appearance bore a general resemblance to the identikit image compiled from Valerie Storie's description, though there were discrepancies, including eye colour, his transient movements between hotels, and inconsistent statements increased police suspicion. In early September 1961, Aycott held a press conference and issued a detailed and urgent appeal to the press, seeking information about a man matching the circulated description. Peter Louis Alphon, 31, born Croydon, Surrey. 5'9" to 10 inches tall. Slim build, complexion pale, hair dark brown, brushed back and flat, eyes hazel, straight small nose, thin lips, round chin, well spoken, speaks like a Londoner and in a quiet voice. It went on to give so much detail, it was said to be the most detailed appeal ever given out at the time. A phone number was also issued with the appeal, both in the paper and when Aycott went on the news. The size of the manhunt was big, and when asked later why he'd put so much into Peter Alphon when he had another suspect, Aycott replied that he had to get Alphon in to eliminate him, and the man called Ryan hadn't been identified yet. It didn't take long before Alphon presented himself to the police on the night of the 22nd of September 1961 and was arrested in the early hours of the 23rd of September. He was questioned by police officers under Detective Superintendent Bob Aycott and subsequently placed in identity parades. Witnesses connected with the Vienna Hotel and with the separate assault on Mrs. Delisle were asked to attend. Mr. Nudd, one of the Vienna Hotel caretakers, indicated Alphon during the parade, though he seemed uncertain. Mrs. Delisle initially failed to identify anyone while viewing the parade, but after leaving she became distressed and later stated that the second man in the lineup, Alphon, was the man who had assaulted her. Because she didn't identify him on the spot during the formal procedure, the identification was, in the eyes of the law, legally weakened. There was one more identity parade to be carried out, and that would take place on Sunday the 24th at Guy's Hospital, where Valerie Storie was recovering after another operation. Men from a local club had been asked to volunteer for the line-up. 9 men were chosen and Peter Alphon was brought in. They were all handed numbered cards and stood in a room. Valerie Storie lay in her bed behind a screen. The men couldn't see her. She looked across the line of men for at least 7 minutes, and Valerie failed to pick out Alphon. And with this, the case against Peter Alphon, being the A6 killer, fell apart. Detective Superintendent Aycott made the controversial decision to release him. He was released from custody on December the 26th, 1961. From here, Detective Superintendent Robert Aycott and the murder squad began looking into J. Ryan, the other name that appeared in the Vienna Hotel register that stayed there leading up to the A6 attack. In September 1961, while moving between lodgings in Ireland, James Francis Hanratty was travelling under the name J. Ryan. It was an alias he had used before. Hanratty was semi-literate and often relied on others to write things for him. While in Dublin, he struck up a conversation with a travelling salesman, John Sullivan. During their brief acquaintance, Hanratty asked the man for a small favour. He wanted to send postcards home to England, but asked Sullivan to write and address them for him. One of the cards was addressed to Mary Hanratty at the family home in Kingsbury, northwest London. The message began simply, "Dear Mum." At the time, the request seemed unremarkable, but days later, the newspapers carried appeals from police searching for a man using the name J. Ryan in connection with the notorious A6 murder. The coincidence struck Sullivan immediately. A man calling himself Ryan had asked him to write a postcard, yet it had been addressed to someone named Hanratty. He contacted the authorities. At Scotland Yard, detectives followed up the lead with the name Hanratty and the Kingsbury address in hand. They searched their criminal record, and what they found was a similar name, James Hanratty, a small-time offender with previous convictions for burglary and vehicle theft. The description recorded in his police file bore a striking resemblance to the identity image that had been constructed from the testimony of Valerie Storie. There was another detail that caught the detective's attention. Hanratty was already known to use aliases, making the leap from Ryan to Hanratty far more likely. Once they had a suspect in mind, investigators began to tighten the net using forensic and witness evidence. Handwriting experts examined the signature J. Ryan recorded in the registers of the Ormond Hotel and the Vienna Hotel. When compared with samples of Hanratty's writing, specialists concluded that entries had been written by the same hand. Staff from both hotels later stated that the man that had been staying under the name Ryan was Hanratty. Some would go on to repeat the identification during formal police lineups. Piece by piece, the fragments of evidence began to align. An alias, a postcard, a name in the police files, and a face that matched the composite image. For the detectives investigating the A6 murder, the trail was beginning to lead in one direction. On September the 26th, Aycott and Oxford went to Mr. and Mrs. Hanratty's home in Kingsbury, the address they had got from the postcard information. Aycott and Oxford spoke with James's parents and told them they wanted to speak with their son in connection with a serious matter. James's father was cooperative, but protective. He told the police that James wasn't there and that he hadn't seen his son for some time. They searched James's bedroom looking for any evidence that might connect him to the A6 crime. After further investigation, detectives realised some of the terms the gunman had used, that he had served a full sentence recently and he had done corrective training. They discovered that only 5 men in the country had recently served an entire CT sentence without remission, and Hanratty was one of them. James Hanratty was now Aycock's chief suspect. His name and description were circulated to police forces across the country and in Ireland. Hanratty was in Ireland, so Aycock and Oxford got on a plane. Ports and airports were alerted. Aycock and Oxford were searching in Dublin alongside the Irish police. Their search took them through 26 counties. The authorities checked guest houses, hotels and transport hubs across the entire country. At the time, it was one of the largest cooperation efforts between British and Irish police. Detectives returned to London because they had evidence, including phone calls and sightings, that James had boarded a ferry back to the UK. Staying in Ireland was no longer productive once they confirmed he was no longer there. Where had James Hanratty been all this time? He had travelled to Ireland on the 4th of September and stayed at the Ormond Hotel. After this, he returned to London a week later and stayed with a middle-aged antique dealer, Mrs. Anderson, who helped him out financially as well as giving him a roof over his head for a while. He continued to commit robberies and apparently bought a car. He showed it to the Frances and took some girls out for dates, wearing the dark blue chalk striped suit. Just a few days later, he met his cousin, who told him that the police were looking for him in connection with a housebreaking in Ruislip. He now realised he must have left some fingerprints and took off, moving from house to house and hotel to hotel. Late September, he stole a black jacket from a house and wore it over his own waistcoat and his distinctive blue chalk-striped trousers in an attempt at a disguise. At the beginning of October, he went to Ealing to sell a stolen diamond ring, and at some point after this, he heard he was wanted for the A6 killing. He called Dixie France at home, unaware that the police had tapped the phone line. The police attempted to trace the call in real time. While they didn't catch him during the call, the trace narrowed down the area he was calling from to the Enfield area. Hanratty must have realised, hung up and vanished. Hanratty made calls to Aycock at Scotland Yard between October the 5th and October the 11th. He repeated he had nothing to do with this crime and wouldn't give himself up. He was wanted for housebreaking and wasn't going to go away again. Hanratty realised London was becoming too dangerous. This is when he made the decision to head north to Liverpool. By October the 8th, 1961, the police had officially named James Hanratty as the man they wanted to interview. Newspapers across the country printed his description and linked him to the J. Ryan alias from the Vienna Hotel. While on the run, Hanratty called the Daily Mail and the Daily Express and declared that he was an innocent man, but couldn't give himself up. He said he could prove he was in London on Monday the 21st of August and he went to Liverpool on Tuesday the 22nd in the morning. But it was generally reported that he gave inconsistent alibi details. Early October, he continued stealing cars. He went to Manchester and, after abandoning a stolen car, caught a train to Liverpool. And while in Liverpool, he called Aycock. He told Aycock that he had been to see the friends he had stayed with at the time of the murder, but they did not want to come forward. The men, he claimed, did not want to get in trouble as they were fencers. He repeated that he had spent the night of the 21st to the 22nd of August at the Vienna Hotel and the next morning had gone to Liverpool. Aycock pressed him to tell him their names, but he wouldn't. October the 9th and 11th, Aycock and Oxford re-interviewed Mr. and Mrs. Hanratty, and, under the advice of a solicitor, they helped the police in tracing their son. James Hanratty sent his mother flowers on the 9th. He then visited a doctor before having his hair bleached at a hairdresser that left an unfortunate orange tint. Hanratty realised that Liverpool was no longer safe for him, so managed to avoid the police in Liverpool. He travelled by bus to Blackpool, arriving late that afternoon. He checked into the Hotel Windsor. On the evening of the 11th of October 1961, Hanratty went for something to eat at the Stavonia Cafe on Central Drive. He was sitting alone eating a meal. A while out on a routine police check, two police officers saw him and they decided to wait outside. They apprehended him as he left the cafe and was charged with housebreaking in the metropolitan London area. Aycott was informed in the early hours, and he and D.S. Oxford made their way straight to Blackpool. Aycott and Oxford arrived at Blackpool early on the 12th of October and began the interview almost immediately. Apparently, the interviews that followed became a key part of the prosecution's case. However, during the trial, James Hanratty and the two officers strongly disagreed about what had actually been said. Hanratty's solicitor hadn't been present at the interview. Bob Aycott asked the questions, and Detective Sergeant John Oxford wrote down Hanratty's replies. Oxford's notes that were later presented as key prosecution evidence. It was not standard practice in 1961 to obtain signed verbatim transcripts. Hanratty hadn't acknowledged them as an accurate record of the interview. According to Aycott, Hanratty was cautioned that anything that he said could be taken down in evidence and used against him. And it's claimed Hanratty replied, "Fire away, ask what you like, I've got nothing to hide." Hanratty disputed this. It seems the questions revolved around his movements the week of the taking of Michael Gregsten's life and Valerie Storie's violation, and they asked about the clothing he had worn at the time. This went on for a few hours before stopping later in the morning. Another interview was had in the afternoon that didn't last as long this time. Aycott wanted to know about his alibi in Liverpool. He continued to push for the names of his alibis. When Aycott revealed the discovery of the cartridges in the Vienna hotel, it was a bombshell moment. He admitted staying in the room, but claimed he had no knowledge of the cartridges. This forced him to lean even harder into his Liverpool alibi to explain away the physical evidence linking him to the weapon. So what did they have? Two cartridge cases were discovered in the room where he stayed the night before Michael Gregsten's life was taken. It's thought Hanratty knew places to hide worthless jewellery, such as under the back seat of a bus, and a gun used to shoot Gregsten was later found concealed beneath a bus seat, though that doesn't prove Hanratty put it there. There were no prints. Hanratty also matched certain elements of the gunman's self-description in the car. The killer had called himself Jim and said he had done the lot of 3 years corrective training, both of which applied to Hanratty. However, there was no identification evidence against him at that stage, nor any evidence placing him at Deadman's Hill. Superintendent Barron turned up the next morning on October the 12th and formally charged Hanratty with the murder of Michael Gregsten. He was escorted back to Bedford. They arrived back on October the 13th, and on that same day an identity parade was set up and witnesses were brought in. Mr. Skillett picked Hanratty. Mr. Trower also picked out Hanratty. The garage owner, Mr. Herons, picked out someone else. Valerie Storie had yet to go on the next identity parade. On Saturday the 14th of October, 12 volunteers, including RAF personnel, stood in a line in front of Valerie Storie's bed at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. She looked across the line for a good 10 minutes, then asked for them to say the line, "Be quiet, will you? I'm thinking." They all responded. She spent a little more time looking, then spoke Hanratty's number. On January the 16th, 1962, additional charges of attempted murder and the violation of Valerie Storie were added. The trial of 25-year-old James Hanratty opened on the 22nd of January 1962 at the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Gorman. The case attracted enormous public and press attention. The brutality of the crime, the survival of a key witness, and the apparent trail of circumstantial and forensic evidence combined to make it one of the most talked about trials of the era. The courtroom was frequently crowded and reporting was extensive. Members of the Hanratty family attended the proceedings, openly supporting and maintaining his innocence throughout. The prosecution alleged that on the 22nd into the 23rd of August 1961, Gregsten and Storie were confronted in a parked car by an armed man who forced them to drive around for several hours before shooting them at Deadman's Hill. Gregsten died at the scene. Storie survived despite being paralyzed. The centre of the Crown's case was identification. Valerie Storie gave evidence over several days, describing her ordeal in detail and identifying Hanratty as the gunman. Her testimony was calm but emotionally powerful, and it became one of the most closely scrutinised elements of the entire trial. The jury also heard about the forensic findings. The 2 cartridge cases that were recovered from a London hotel room where Hanratty had stayed shortly before the murder were found in the hotel room in early September 1961, and forensic testing later connected them to the gun. The revolver, later found under the back seat of a bus, was forensically linked to the bullets used in the shooting. The prosecution argued that this weapon was the murder gun. Additional evidence concerned Hanratty's movements in the days before and after the crime. Witnesses placed him in locations that, according to the Crown, undermined his alibi. Initially, James Hanratty told both his solicitors and the police that he'd been in Liverpool on the night of the 22nd of August 1961, when Michael Gregsten was shot. He said he was either staying with a friend or trying to find a man he referred to as Joe. He named the streets, and police made extensive inquiries there, visiting houses along the streets he'd specified, but no one remembered him, and some of the house numbers he gave didn't match his description. Shortly before his trial, Hanratty changed his account entirely. He now claimed that he had in fact been in Rhyl, North Wales. According to this revised version, he arrived on the evening of the 22nd of August 1961 and stayed until the 24th of August. He gave detailed descriptions of the boarding house where he said he had lodged, mentioning features such as a small room under the stairs with a green bath and a particular attic bedroom. The prosecution, led by Graham Swanwick, QC, argued that this late change severely damaged Hanratty's credibility. The jury was invited to consider why an innocent man with a genuine alibi would give a false account for weeks. The Crown contended that the Liverpool story had been fabricated, and it collapsed under police investigation, and was then replaced with the Rhyl account as a last-minute alternative. A Rhyl landlady, Grace Jones, eventually gave evidence for the defence, although aspects of her testimony appeared at first to support Hanratty's presence. Her recollection of dates became uncertain under cross-examination, and in the end the Rhyl alibi could not firmly tie Hanratty to the crucial night of the 22nd and the 23rd of August. Statements he made during police interviews were also presented, though aspects of those interviews were disputed by the defence. Hanratty denied all involvement. He initially claimed he had been in Liverpool at the time of the murder, later changing his alibi to say he had been in Rhyl, North Wales. The defence argued that he had confused his dates when first questioned and insisted he had no connection to the crime scene. Counsel for the defence challenged the reliability of the identification evidence, suggesting that Storie's recollection may have been influenced by stress and by subsequent events. They also questioned the handling of forensic materials and the circumstances in which statements had been taken from Hanratty. Hanratty himself gave evidence, something not all defendants chose to do at the time. He maintained his innocence under cross-examination, though the prosecution pressed him on inconsistencies in his account. After a lengthy summing up by Mr. Justice Gorman, what would be debated at a later date, and several hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 17th of February 1962. Hanratty was sentenced to death, the mandatory penalty for murder at the time. He was executed at HM Prison, Bedford, on the 4th of April 1962. The case did not end there. In the decades that followed, it became one of the most debated criminal convictions in British legal history, with campaigns both asserting and disputing Hanratty's guilt, a controversy that continued long after the trial itself. Between approximately 1966 and 1971, Peter Alphon made a series of statements suggesting involvement in the A6 murder. These statements were inconsistent and details changed over time. In different accounts, he referred to his resemblance to the police identity image, suggested that his accent could shift under stress, described himself as a poor driver in a way he implied matched witness descriptions, and mentioned receiving unexplained sums of money in the period following the crime. Campaigners examining the conviction of James Hanratty drew attention to reported bank deposits totaling several £1,000s made by Alphon between late 1961 and mid-1962. However, no conclusive evidential link between these funds and the murder of Michael Gregsten was ever established. Alphon was never charged with the offence and later withdrew his confessions. He died in January 2009 after a fall. Following the execution, controversy developed around the safety of Hanratty's conviction. Questions were raised about the reliability of the identification evidence given by Valerie Storie. Critics claimed that Valerie Storie's description and identification of James Hanratty did not remain entirely consistent from the earliest stages of the investigation to the trial. Supporters of the conviction maintained that her identification was clear and unwavering. There was also controversy surrounding Hanratty's alibi. He initially claimed to have been in Liverpool at the time of the murder of Michael Gregsten, but later changed his account to say he'd been in Brill, North Wales. Debate centred on whether this change fatally damaged his credibility or whether it could be explained by confusion over dates. The handling of exhibits became another focal point. The revolver said to be the murder weapon had been found on a London bus, and the cartridge cases had been discovered in the Vienna hotel room, linked to Hanratty. In later years, questions were raised about whether there was a clear, documented and uninterrupted record showing exactly who had possession of the exhibits at every stage. Any unclear gaps could raise doubts about whether the items could have been interfered with while in police custody. Critics have maintained that the integrity of the evidence exhibits had been sufficiently preserved. Following intense public pressure, the case was referred to the Court of Appeal in 1967. However, without forensic evidence, the court found no reason to overturn the jury's original 1962 verdict, and the conviction was upheld. Decades later, advances in forensic science allowed fresh examination of retained exhibits. In the early 2000s, DNA testing was carried out on preserved items, including a handkerchief said to have been used by the gunman during the attack, as well as semen-stained underwear worn by Valerie Storie at the time of the assault. DNA from Hanratty's brother was used to establish a familial profile. This initial test suggested the DNA on the exhibits belonged to a close relative of theirs, which provided the legal justification to exhume Hanratty's body for a direct comparison. James Hanratty's body was exhumed in 2001, and the DNA profile obtained from the exhumed body matched the semen on Storie's underwear. The DNA from the handkerchief with the mucus or saliva was also reported to match Hanratty's profile. The probability of the DNA belonging to anyone else was calculated at 1 in 37 million. In 2002, the Court of Appeal concluded that the DNA evidence strongly supported the safety of the conviction. Despite that ruling, public and academic debate continued, with some maintaining that the original investigation and trial were flawed and arguing that the exhibits might have been contaminated. However, the court held that accidental contamination was effectively impossible. Hanratty's family consistently maintained that he'd been wrongly convicted. Over the years, the family supported efforts to reopen the case and cooperated with journalists and campaigners, including Paul Foot, whose book Who Killed Hanratty argued that the conviction was unsafe. The family remained involved in appeals and public debate for decades. After the Court of Appeal upheld the conviction in light of the DNA evidence, the ruling was a heavy blow to the family's long campaign, although some relatives continued to express doubts. For them, the judgment was not the end of the story.
He said, "Dad, there's only one thing I want you to do, is to clear my name."
Of course Hanratty's the man. I was there, I saw him. There's no possible doubt whatsoever. I certainly knew his voice when I heard it. Beyond any doubt whatsoever, Hanratty was guilty. I know, I was there.
Thank you for watching, or even just listening.